education is a local responsibility. Education policy is often set at the state level. And in fact, 90% of funding comes from the local and state level. About 10% of funding in general comes from the federal government. It varies wildly across school districts. When you're talking like 14,000 school districts, some of them serving very low income populations, they're going to receive a much higher percentage of Title I funds than a wealthy school district. And I live in the Washington, D.C. area. Our school districts love DEI. They have built out these infrastructures and they are so attached to them and can't imagine doing anything differently. They've done it long enough that it feels like it's ingrained, and it's really hard to change anything in a large bureaucracy. The system often wins against the parents because the students move on through and they graduate. Or the parents who, rose up to fight like Common Core, they moved on, but even before their students graduated, they got weary. This vigilance, they wear you down. Ibram X. Kendi should not be in the classroom. We should not give him any time. We need to focus on math and reading instruction. And if our math and reading scores are as low as the nation's report card is showing us, history, civics, science, all the other subjects are even worse. So for the K-12 level of things, I say just get the concepts out. We don't have time. We really need to focus on academic instruction.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. I'm here today with Ginny Gentles, who is the director of the Education Freedom and Parental Rights program at the Defense of Freedom Institute. She has really been one of the major advocates on education choice. She's frequently before the House of Representatives and other congressional hearings and the like. She's really one of the real prominent voices on education reform in this country. And I'm very honored to speak to you, Ginny. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me, David. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so this is an interesting, unique moment in education change. Can you characterize where you think we are right now, given President Donald Trump's ascending to office? Where do you? How would you characterize this moment?
Well, I think that your listeners know that K-12 education policy is not driven at the federal level. So although the conversation is very heated and very hyperbolic right now, given Trump's new engagement in the federal education policy realm, I think we can all be assured that education is a local responsibility. Education policy is often set at the state level. And in fact, the majority of funding, 90% of funding, comes from the local and state level. So yes, we've got a lot to talk about when it comes to federal education policy, but we always have to keep in mind that this is the state and local's responsibility. It's the parents' responsibility to stay engaged and on top of what's happening in their schools and their community. And we don't need to freak out just because some new things are being proposed at the federal level.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I'm personally supportive of much of what he's trying to do. A little nervous sometimes that there'll be overreach in the process as well. But I'm also aware of what you're saying, that this is primarily education is primarily a state and local issue. What points of leverage might there be, if any, from the federal level? If Donald Trump is successful in pushing forward changes in education, how will that have happened?
There are a number of different approaches that the Trump administration is taking. And right out the gate, we saw executive orders. So EOs, as we refer to them too much in DC, because we use acronyms too much
Uh-huh.
in DC. Lots of EOs out there when it comes to education. And initially, it was focused on getting men and boys out of women's sports and spaces. That was an early EO. We had executive orders focused on getting DEI and radical ideologies out of education. A number of EOs focused specifically on gender ideology. Knock it off. We're not going to teach children that they could have been born in the wrong body, that doctors guessed when they were born. And we're not going to hide information from parents anymore about gender confused children and whether they're embracing new identities at schools. So that DEI, the women's sports and spaces, the gender ideology, those were real priorities. We also saw an executive order focused on expanding education freedom with instructions not just to the Department of Education, but to the Department of Health and Human Services, to the Interior, to Defense, to go and look at opportunities for shifting federal funds to support parents making a choice for their child and expanding education freedom options. And then most recently, of course, we had the executive order that encouraged the Secretary of Education to do all things within the law to start shutting down the Department of Education. So those EOs are all one category. There's other things that the president can and should be doing, including Office for Civil Rights investigations. And I know we'll dig into those in our conversation. And there are investigations into violations of FERPA, or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, that are happening right now. And of course, the president is not afraid to threaten to withhold federal funding. And there's a number of different mechanisms that this administration is doing. Yes, we've heard about that with Columbia University at the higher education level,
Right.
but we're seeing some evidence that that might start happening at the K-12 level as well.
Are we going to start seeing massive numbers of school systems in the next several months, announce the cancellation of their DEI programs? I know we're seeing some of that at universities, not necessarily, some of them probably fearful of losing federal funds, some of them because there are rising internal pressures. Take a look at University of Michigan, for example. I don't know to what degree it's been threatened with the loss of funds. I'm sure that they feel a sense of threat around that, but there's also trustees who are pushing back against this gargantuan expenditure of resources in DEI. Do we see local school districts actually taking heed here?
Well, let's get a little wonky first, before
Sure.
we project what the districts are and might be doing. The Trump administration had one more tool, as we were
Hmm.
listing the various tools, and this is what's called like a certification of assurances. So that every school district was instructed within the last week or so to fill out a form indicating that they would not be violating Title VI. And David, you're probably better versed at Title VI than I am. I'm not a lawyer, but basically they would not be violating federal civil rights laws. And let me just go ahead and say it so I'm getting it right. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. So basically, they have to sign this assurance that if they want their big pots of federal funding, and we're talking about school districts, that they're not going to be violating Title VI. They're not going to be discriminating against
Right.
students, and that's an interesting development. A big pot of federal funding would be Title I, and that's Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, also from the mid 60s. And that's somewhere between 18 and $19 billion that goes out to school districts across the country. They want their Title I funding.
What does it go toward?
Well, it's designed to go to struggling lower income students. Of course, because it's a federal program and it's been around for 50 years, it's gotten increasingly complex. There are numerous components. The formulas have garbled the program so much that it goes to all kinds of school districts and all kinds of schools, and it just gets spread across all this administration that we've seen grow in the K-12 system. So ideally, it would go straight to classrooms, to students, to low-income students, to struggling students, to help them achieve and close achievement gaps, but it gets gobbled up by the system in far too many places. But it's an important source of funding for school districts to fund.
What about 2-3% of their budget is Title One? Is how do you calculate the amount of money the federal funds enter into local school districts?
Oh, so about 10% of funding in general comes from the federal government. It varies wildly across school districts. When you're talking like 14,000 school districts, some of them serving very low income populations, they're going to receive a much higher percentage of Title I funds than a wealthy school district. So it's going to vary significantly, um, and again, the formulas kind of mess that up and complicate that further. But let's just say on average, 10% of funding is coming from the federal government. A good chunk of that is Title I. So when they're signing for these assurances, they want their Title I funding, and I haven't seen how that we haven't seen how that's playing out yet. Are they signing? Like, are they saying we're not going to violate Title VI? We're not going to discriminate, and we're going to agree with the Trump administration's interpretation of what we're signing here. Um, I-
Which is basically that it's discriminatory to have a DEI program that divides people up by race, that rewards or that punishes people by their identity categories and the like. In other words, the DEI superstructure is basically in and of itself engaging in a kind of racism and discrimination, and there's no such thing as reverse discrimination under Title VI, and therefore we're going to view that as a category of discrimination, and therefore you're in violation of that if you continue to undertake certain programs like DEI.
Yeah. And I mean, you and I live in the Washington, D.C. area. We know that our school districts love DEI.
They love
They
it.
have built out these infrastructures and they are so attached to them and can't imagine doing anything differently. And a number of them, if you're talking about a school district like Fairfax County, Virginia, I think they see it from like a moral standpoint.
Yeah,
This would be morally wrong to tear down this DEI infrastructure that clearly is not helping students because the
right,
achievement gaps are egregious and and upsetting when you look
right.
at the performance across racial groups and the performance from low income students, low performing students, and the higher performing higher income students. The gaps are abysmal. So DEI has not served students well, but I would be shocked if Fairfax County goes quietly and says, "Sure, let's dismantle." So, I mean, first of all, they might be coming from this like, "Gosh, well, we've always done this." They haven't, but they've done it long enough that it feels like it's ingrained, and it's really
Yes,
hard to change anything in a large bureaucracy, and that's what you're talking about with these, especially these large school districts. And then there's the moral, like, well, we are social justice warriors. How could we do anything differently?
yeah,
It would be wrong to agree to the Trump administration, to capitulate to the Trump administration, and to dismantle DEI. And then, um, and then third, school districts often will justify fighting any change by saying that they're the largest employer in their area, or that it would be wrong to fire people. Like they view their role as an employer as higher than their role as educators and serving students.
right.
They want to serve those adults in the system. So the idea of moving the adults around or firing staff that are no longer needed because we're not going to bow down to DEI anymore, that's something that they can't wrap their heads around.
Yeah. Is there a legal case that you see working its way through the courts right now that would that would sort of validate the Trump administration's interpretation of DEI? I mean, I know we have the affirmative action in higher education case that's been adjudicated, but it would seem to me that it's one thing to ignore a presidential executive order and even compromise 2% or 3% of your budget and on some moral grounds, and it would be another if the Supreme Court ultimately rules yes, this is a form of discrimination and you must stop. And I it would be hard for me to imagine school systems resisting that kind of legal demand.
Yeah, I'm not sure at the K-12 level if there's something that's percolating up that might have that kind of widespread impact. I think one area of the legal battle to keep an eye on is, okay, if these school districts are signing on to these assurances that they're going to comply with the Trump administration interpretation of that Supreme Court decision, the Students for Fair Admissions
Yes.
decision, and Title VI. But then they don't. They keep their DEI apparatus. They keep their discriminatory processes. Well, you're violating False Claims Act, I believe, and so there could be
Mm,
a legal path to go down there. Well, you said you were going to
right.
comply, and but I'm seeing, you know, 10 to 200 DEI staff. They might have renamed them a little because that's
Yes.
happening, of course. Like they have new
Yes.
titles, but they're doing the same thing. So that's a false claim
It
right
would
there.
seem to be, it would seem very hard to ultimately hide that. I mean, any due diligence would be able to, or a kid brings some material home from some training. I mean, it would be very easy to ultimately, I think, I don't take one teacher who went through some wayward training telling, one of our various legal societies that, yeah, they say they're not doing DEI, but here's what we just went through in our teacher development program.
So,
Uh,
yeah, you mentioned two important things that people should be keeping an eye on. Because one concern that I have is that people of a more conservative leaning might think, well, we have all these executive orders. The president has issued all these executive orders,
right.
and we can say what we want on Twitter now. It's done. We're good. No.
I just had a piece on this last week in Real Education, basically saying that yes, maybe we've passed peak woke in society at large, but we are not past peak woke in K through 12 education, which is in some ways doubling down on it because it sees the writing on the wall. It knows that these programs are in contention now, so they're doing everything that they can to sort of lock it all in. I think, right?
They're locking it in, and the thing is, we are talking about large bureaucracies, and bureaucracies beyond just the 14,000 or so school districts. We're talking about the bureaucracies of that professional development that you referenced. So those teacher
Yes.
training and the entities that have been making a lot of money creating training for PD, for professional development for teachers, all based on these DEI principles. All based
Yes.
on, let's also expand that to gender ideology as well. Like
Yeah.
this was their bread and butter. So to turn
Yes.
that around suddenly, that would be difficult. Also, they don't want to, right?
They
Like
don't
this
want
is
to.
they
Right.
believe in it, and they've been doing it. So you've got the status quo that you're fighting up against, and then yeah, they've been making a lot of money. So like, hey, let's see if we can keep doing this without getting in trouble. So you do need that teacher to report that, hey, this is still happening, and it's hard to buck the system,
Yeah.
particularly if you're going to be punished not just by your school district but by your union if you
Yes.
speak up. So the teachers are going to have to keep an eye on that, and anyone who can access those materials will have to keep an eye on the professional development and what's going on there. And then you mentioned students bringing materials home. Parents will continue to have to be vigilant. But David, the
Yes.
thing is, the system often wins against the parents because the students move on through and they graduate.
Yes.
Or the parents who, rose up to fight like Common Core, whatever the last generation's battle was. They moved on, but even before their students graduated, they got weary. It's this
They wear
vigilance.
you down.
They
The system
wear
wears, yeah.
you down. So you're talking about having to keep up what's been happening the last 5 years as all of this has come to light, as it's been exposed for at least another 5 years. And
Yeah.
that's a lot to ask.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a long-term battle, no doubt about it. So it sounds like I'm going to try to characterize your view. Tell me if I'm wrong. It sounds like you agree that the president and the White House and the federal level have some leverage to bear on this that we should take full advantage of and try to capitalize on. But at the same time, it's not just going to go away with the wave of a magic wand or the signing of an executive order. This is going to be something that we're fighting at the state and local levels. So if I'm right about that, and you're right about that, if that's a correct characterization, what are the points of leverage that we should be bringing to bear to challenge these gargantuan systems? Or let me just, maybe we start with smaller systems that are a little less complicated, places where this ideology is infiltrated, where and try to win there and create bright spots for the rest of the country that we can then capitalize on. I mean, what is your approach to trying to get change, or what do you think parents ought to do, or groups like the North American Values Institute should do?
I appreciate all the efforts that people have done so far. I had my little part of it. Yes, I can testify before Congress, but when I was at the Independent Women's Forum, I had a weekly teachers union report card, and I thought, well, I'll write
Amazing.
this as long as I can come up with something each week to expose what unions are doing to harm the local, state, and national components of education policy. I'll keep doing it. And it was so easy to keep doing it because the unions were creating so much harm. So I would say there's so much that's happening at the state level, and there's laws that are being passed, but sometimes it's whack-a-mole. Like if you ban CRT, or you say we're not going to preach gender ideology to K to 8. It's kind of whack-a-mole. It just pops up somewhere else or in some other form. So I think we need to look at, like, where is it coming from? Well,
Yeah.
I think it's coming from the teachers unions and the education schools. So
Yes.
until we get really serious about the teachers unions exposing what they're doing, holding them accountable for it, recognizing that the teachers union is not your warm and fuzzy third grade teacher who
Right.
you love and like feel is such an important part of your child's life. The teachers
Mhm.
union is a whole other pernicious entity altogether. Then we're not going to make the progress that we need to make. And until we look at what the ed schools are doing and what they're teaching these young, impressionable people who want to go teach, and the deep and recognize the deprogramming that will be necessary to get them in a healthy place, a non-DEI gender ideology advocating place, then I think this whack-a-mole approach that's been going on at the state level, which again I appreciate, isn't going to work.
Mm. So yeah, let's dig in there a little bit. I mean, if you asked me what are the two vectors of transmission here, I would have cited the same two that you just did.
Okay,
I
good.
used to work, by the way, at 15th and M Street in DC, right across the street from the National Education Association building, and I would go to the cafeteria there to have lunch. And it was a bunch of mild mannered, professional staff people. Most of them looked you know. Pretty old. They weren't like this young purple-haired social justice warrior crowd at all. I don't remember seeing anybody like that. They probably, it was probably a very different, and this is going back maybe to 2007, 2008, whatever. And now, you see that NEA is officially advocating what's called white supremacy culture framework, which holds that values like being on time, being a perfectionist, or being objective are white supremacy values. And school systems like the schools that my kids went to, like Montgomery County Public Schools, have embraced this white supremacy culture framework in their teacher development training, even in the classroom. I've seen evidence of it. So clearly, something has happened in these teachers' unions in the last you know 15, 20 years that how when did this grand capturing happen of an NEA? Or I think AFT is also, I mean, I know it's also very ideological in a lot of ways, but I'm not sure it's quite as crazy as NEA. Maybe I'm wrong. um
Well, interesting that you say that. I think that it's important to draw a distinction between the NEA, the National Education Association, which is led by Becky Pringle right now, and the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, which is led by Randy Weingarten. Randy Weingarten gets all the attention in the media, right? Becky
yeah,
Pringle's she's flying under the radar. But you're
right,
saying, hey, maybe keep an eye on the NEA. Like, they're
right.
maybe up to more shenanigans than the AFT. It's just that Randy Weingarten
Yeah,
says things that are
right.
more inflammatory, and just gets more media attention. The other reason to keep an eye on the NEA is that it actually is the teachers union. There are, I think, close to 3 million members, and a number of them are retired. Some of them might be allies and others, but it really is the teachers union. A lot of NEA chapters are in the suburbs where we live and in other places around the country. The AFT, I believe, has 1.7 million members and 6 different big buckets of members, only one of which are K-12 teachers. They have nurses and air traffic controllers and graduate assistants, and they're across the spectrum. They're just a union. They're just a big old labor union,
Hmm.
and they actually brag. The AFT, American Federation of Teachers, brags that it's the fastest growing healthcare union in the
Wow.
country. I think it might be the second largest healthcare union. So they represent Planned Parenthood. This is not really a teachers union, so it's kind
Hmm.
of strange that Randy Weingarten and AFT gets all of the attention.
Yeah.
Pay attention to the NEA.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then if you look at both organizations' business items for their summer conferences, both have a lot of radicals that are operating at the local level. We've been seeing a lot of anti-Semitism coming out of Massachusetts Teachers Union, for example. So it's coming from the state level, but then it's
Oh yeah, we're
percolating
very
up.
familiar.
Yeah, I would
MTA.
imagine you know this
Yeah.
backwards and forwards, but Massachusetts isn't alone, and you look at the
Yeah.
proposals from the local unions for those national gatherings, all these business items. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in there. There's a ton of DEI. There's just leftist progressive ideology from around the country. So keeping an eye on the NEA, not just Becky, not just Randy, but what is the state union doing and what are the
Yeah.
local unions doing, because they might shock you just how radical they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have these teachers' colleges, which are decolonizing the curriculum, quote unquote. And we've been looking into that about how popular of a pedagogy decolonizing the curriculum really is. And it's this idea that that the way we teach kids is based on sort of a white supremacy imperialistic, you know, worldview, and that we have to strip our curriculum of any Western influences, and that's what decolonizing it is. And you have a whole generation of teachers now. When we've looked into this, and I know Parents Defending Ed has done some analysis on this as well. It looks like this is very widespread. It's not so, you might say, well, maybe there's a class here and there, and you're then blowing it up into some um, into some grand claim. But no, actually, the entire education program is really about decolonizing the curriculum. And a whole generation of teachers have been schooled in decolonizing the curriculum. I mean, what do we do about that?
What do we do about that? We worry, and
We worry a
and
lot.
yeah, and we continue to expose that because you know that, I know that. Nikki Neely and the Defending Ed education crowd knows that. More people need to know that. Like we might think, well, my child's going off to the state university to major in education. That's great. I'm so proud of him or her. But let's look at what we're sending our child into, and then we might think it's great that we're expanding education freedom and school choice. Well, if the teachers are coming from these same universities, these same teachers' colleges programmed a certain way, those alternatives to the traditional public school are potentially going to be risky as well.
Yeah, and
So,
and there's some analysis that I've recently seen. Maybe there was a paper done. I'd have to pull it up that said well, look, there's a good argument for education choice in and of itself. But putting that aside, it may not be an antidote to de-radicalization if the teachers are coming from the same place and the school boards the school trustees are supporting it, and you have headmasters who are every bit as ideologically inclined, in some cases more so than the average, let's say, superintendent of a large school system.
yeah, when you're talking about the NAIS, those elite private schools, and there are not that many of them, and they're so expensive and out of reach for most families, and certainly most families participating in the state school choice programs that are expanding now. Those are worrisome as far as how woke or progressive or captured they are. I happily send my children to faith based schools, and I'm very very content there and assured because I know the pipeline, how the teachers flow to those schools, the hiring process,
Mhm.
and can trust it. But I do think again, vigilance is really important. But it shouldn't have to be. That shouldn't have to be on the parents to worry about what's being taught and how students are being indoctrinated at teachers' colleges. I do think that rather than focusing on the whack-a-mole of ban CRT and that sort of thing, that the state legislatures should really start cracking down on the teachers' colleges. Like, let's just really shine the
Go
spotlight.
at it after the at the source. Do you
Yeah.
have any concerns about sort of the banning of divisive concepts as we've seen, let's say in Florida and Texas, that that has that's its own form of a liberalism or can be? I by the way, I'm for major intervention into how government intervention and how both higher education and K through 12 are conducting themselves. But there's a part of me like, would I mind? And maybe I'll put the question to you: if my 11th grader or 12th grader was exposed to Ibram X. Kendi, but also then exposed to the critique of Ibram X. Kendi by John McWhorter. Now, in all honesty, I've seen that only once. I had a teacher who I was talking to who was in general agreement about the nature of the education in his own school and the like, and created a curriculum in which he exposed students to both the sort of anti-racism camp and then the critique of anti-racism, which would probably be absolutely taboo in most schools. But he said it was a marvelous experiment in that he saw some of the students who had been inclined to sort of accept Ibram X. Kendi at face value start to really question it because it's the first time they've actually ever been exposed to the critique. And many of them actually went very quickly in the other direction. Have you thought about that at all as a way of actually fostering free thought and critical thinking in schools?
Well, I'm a K-12 person. I'm only just now getting more into higher education, both because I've got teenagers who are now looking at colleges, and then I'm
Mhm.
also on the board of visitors at a university in Virginia, and then I work at the Defense of Freedom Institute that's very focused on higher education. So I think that what you're proposing is more for higher education. K-12, my gosh, our results are so embarrassing
Yeah.
and so abysmal that we don't need to be having debates. Ibram X. Kendi should not be in the classroom. We should not give him any time. We need to focus on math and reading instruction. And if our math and reading scores are as low as the nation's report card is showing us, when we're talking, a third, if that, of students are proficient in those subjects, history, civics, science, all the other subjects are even worse. So for the K-12 level of things, I say just get the concepts out. We don't have time. We really need to focus on
Mm.
academic instruction.
Yeah. So I want to go there for a second because um, I am a nonprofit executive. I talk to marketing people a lot, messaging, trying to understand the best way to move the needle on these issues. And the one dilemma I'm facing, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is that on the one hand, when it comes to parents and activating parents, or maybe legislators or others, you have to show them the bad stuff and educate them on the bad stuff. Why is this program called critical literacy coming to your schools actually a front for critical race theory or something else and indoctrination? And they have to be able to see the warning signs and then react to them. On the other hand, it seems to me that that's not necessarily the right talking point at the school board meeting. And the right talking point may be what you just said, which is this is a grand distraction. This is our kids are failing, and we need to really focus on the fundamentals in education. Is that the advice you would give to parents, or and how does an organization like ours, who's trying to, on the one hand, motivate parents and help them understand what the actual challenge is, and on the other hand, trying to get them to be effective in the way they talk about these issues in public?
The wonderful thing is that humans are so diverse in their approach to things and what interests them. So I wouldn't necessarily advise a parent like talk about this, but not that. There are some parents who see the books that were uh, that had so much sexually explicit and other
Yeah.
inappropriate content. And they're like, this is horrendous. I have to take action on this. I'm going to speak to my school board now. And so I wouldn't hold them back from that. And thank goodness they've been exposing how inappropriate those books are. And ensuring that school districts are not getting away with continuing to expose children to things that are explicit and inappropriate. And then there are other parents. There's an organization in my community that doesn't touch any of the cultural stuff. They are all about the data and the nuts and bolts. And they are analyzing, hey, we've got a dividing line in our district with wealthy families in the north part, lower income in the south part. Stop it with the averages, and stop bragging, because you're serving the low income students really poorly. And here's the data that proves
Mm.
that. And I have such deep respect for them for what they're doing. So I think that there's a diversity of parents and interests and skills out there. And so I just say, like, all hands on deck.
Right. Just let it all hang out. Don't worry so much about alienating some school board member or winning the conversation. Just let people express their authentic opinions about this. Educate them on what's happening. Give them the tools to talk about it. Give them the tool of talking about the failure of schools. Let me ask you another question. One thing I've heard a lot of is that what we've seen in school systems is kind of a paradigm shift away from sort of the average achievement to an achievement gap measure, which actually supports this sort of overall thrust toward equity. In other words, if you are spending a lot of time measuring achievement gap, then that becomes what you're trying to solve for. So then you might engage in a kind of equity policy, so-called equity policy, that's supposedly meant to actually raise the lower end of the spectrum, but ends up actually just bringing down the top, ending AP programs, ending magnet schools, whatever, just so there's no less disparity. It's bringing the top down. Do you have concern? Like, I'm struggling with this whole idea of achievement gap. I know it's obviously there and it's something you have to be able to talk about, but I worry that the entire metrics of the school systems is now based on achievement gap, and it's causing sort of these skewed policy initiatives that are bad for actually both ends of the spectrum.
Those achievement gaps were an obsession during the heyday of No Child Left Behind, and the approach that what the consensus to education reform was that had to be the focus and the fixation,
Mm-hmm.
and
You
everything.
were at the Department of Ed at that time, right? Weren't you?
I was. It's interesting. I always say I was kind of always the ugly stepchild when I was at the Florida Department of Education,
Uh-huh.
when Governor Bush was not rolling out, they already had, but like ensuring the implementation of the A to F ratings of Florida schools was in place. That accountability was the priority. School choice was there as well. That was an important thing for Governor Bush. But I was kind of like the one school choice person at the accountability table. And then I went to the U.S. Department of Education, where No Child Left Behind was everything to the Bush administration. And I was working in the Office of Innovation and Improvement, being like, but also school choice, expanding options will help too and provide competitive effects. And things have shifted, thankfully, in the last 20 years, where school choice, education freedom, the recognition that hyper focusing on those achievement gaps to the expense of everything else, to the distortion of policy, like what you're talking about, to the harm of higher achieving students, like what you're talking about. We're not going to do that as the number one priority, and we're going to work on expanding education freedom. We're going to ensure that we have merit-based options, and we don't do away with gifted education. I kind of feel like that focus on achievement and accountability, which started with good intentions, but then got distorted, as you said. I feel like we've done a good job exposing the distortion, and we're pulling back from that insanity.
Mhm.
But I don't want to make assumptions that all 14,000 school districts are pulling back from the insanity. So, as with
Mm.
everything we've been talking about, vigilance is important.
Yeah. So, um, you interviewed Linda McMahon on your podcast not too long ago, and since that time, I believe the president issued his executive order, um, And I have to say that I have mixed feelings about it. I actually went to the White House signing, but I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I've seen the Department of Education fund radical education in places like California, and I'm sure there's a whole parade of horribles that we could expose coming out of the Department of Education over the years, in the last administration and the like. And so I completely understand that. On the other hand, isn't this an opportunity for a more robust Secretary of Education, and who shares sort of the desire to end radicalization, to use the full power of the Department of Education to make some changes at the local, state, and local level? And why
Well,
would we want to neuter it now?
I don't think that she's holding back on that front. And you probably would agree if we look at the Office for Civil Rights investigations that have been launched, there are many. And the Office for Civil Rights has been very receptive to defense of freedom, civil rights complaints that we've been filing, where we're shining the lights on additional opportunities for investigation. So, my school district, Arlington Public Schools, is under investigation for allowing, um, a sex offender in girls' locker rooms. Maine, California. Other investigations are underway. The California investigation is not on Title IX, that's on FERPA, that Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So she's not holding back. That Office of Civil Rights, and then also her student privacy office, is very busy right now, and those tools are being used. Nor is there any proposal to do away with that federal role to enforce civil
Mhm.
rights in an appropriate manner. If the office, or offices, if you're including the student privacy office, were to move, the role would
They'd
continue.
move to where? The Justice Department? Is that where your understanding would be?
I feel like that's the common suggestion, but then I also heard that maybe they should move to HHS, because if you're talking about moving Title I and IDEA, that's funding we haven't talked about yet, but that's for students with disabilities,
Yeah.
to the Health and Human Services, then maybe the OCR, Office for Civil Rights, should go as well. Another reason for doing that, if we're being wonky here, is apparently DOJ kind of doesn't start with the investigations at the way that the Department of Education and HHS does. And we need those investigations. We need those warning letters. Hey, we're looking into this, and we want information from
So
you.
DOJ operates differently than that, and that might compromise our ability to see change.
Yeah, I think it's fair enough to send this notice of investigation as a warning, and to like work through the process. And historically, it's only gone through this process of, we'll make sure you come into compliance, so we'll have some sort of agreement in place. But I think that this secretary is not afraid, and we've seen this at the higher education level, to also withhold funding. And so, yeah, let's see what she can do while she does have OCR under her at the Department of Education. But let's be reassured that that role for federal civil rights compliance doesn't go away just because it moves either to DOJ or HHS, or wherever it is that it goes. And then
Yeah.
also, I also want to make sure to say that she's been really clear. I think you heard the president at that White House event. I heard him say, like, this isn't making funding go away. Congress will still appropriate Title I funding. It will still appropriate IDEA funding. The funding will still flow. It's not hard to get funds from the
Sure.
federal government to the states and out the
Right.
door. Those just might move again to somewhere else.
Yeah. So let's talk about the OCR for a second, though. Office for Civil Rights, not to use the Washington acronym addiction. It seems to me that people have said, look, that the whole office was right after the executive order, or right before the executive order, actually, when there were a lot of staff fired from the Department of Education. The people said the Office of Civil Rights has been gutted. That's what I heard from the more progressive Jewish organizations that I used to be part of way back when, not that far way back when. And they said, so this is really Trump actually hampering our ability to fight anti-Semitism. But my understanding, and I don't know if you've looked into this, is that actually the part of the OCR that investigates anti-Semitism cases has not been hit by this. Is that your understanding?
So the reduction in force, I'm going to throw in another acronym, the RIF, that reduced the staff at the Department of Education When it was first announced, we were told that this was bureaucrats serving bureaucrats, that you're talking about shutting down some of the regional offices, and those offices were staffed by Office of Civil Rights attorneys. But the Office of Civil Rights was, I think, the second largest office at the department. It's big. So if you're firing some of the OCR attorneys at the regional offices, that does not mean that you're gutting OCR, Office for Civil Rights, overall. You're just making some wise decisions to start consolidating, shutting down things, stop paying for empty federal office buildings across the country, that sort of thing. But I don't want to say definitively that I know which OCR attorneys, which groups were fired and which weren't. I
Hmm.
don't know how it shook out. But I do think that people need to realize that a lot of those attorneys were not reporting to work. They were, from what I understood, newer hires that hadn't been at the department for as long, and never had reported to those regional offices because people were working from home. So they weren't the experts that we need in the current climate right now when you're talking about a really aggressive office investigating really important issues.
Any other observations about where we are now, where we need to go on education? What should groups like ours, who are mostly concerned about mobilizing parents and very specific communities too, as well? We're looking at in this first round, we're opening up offices in Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, LA. That's we want to have staffed offices in these places to really work closely with parents. We think that you need ground game and fighting against radical ideology. What would you urge us to do at this moment?
I think you're right on track because, as we talked about, the parents graduate out of the system. Their kids move on. They might have moved on from elementary school during the heart of COVID, and they're in high school now, and they're so busy, and the parents are so busy, and so that whole generation of parents that we thought were going to stay so engaged, they're worn out and they're busy and they just assume everything's fine, everything's normal. Just recognizing that the system knows that it can just wait out the frustrated outspoken parents, and you're constantly going to have to be informing parents and making sure that they realize that this normal, with low achievement, with strange ideologies, with inappropriate books, with rampant chronic absenteeism, that's not normal. Don't accept that. And so it sounds like you're right on track.
And we all have to then double down on teachers unions and teachers colleges and the like, because that's going to be an ongoing source of ideological education in schools.
Yeah, and that's where I feel a little more optimistic, even though I don't feel like the work has been done yet to the
Uh-huh.
level it needs to be done. The parent work is tough again because they graduate out, but I think that all of us, if we sort of recognize we can't do this whack-a-mole thing anymore, we can't trust just one governor, if it's Governor DeSantis, or one president, if it's President Trump, to fix this for us. We need to get to the source, and that's the unions and the teachers' colleges. I think if all the groups engage, we could have a real impact.
And I've been in the advocacy world my entire career, but it's hard for me to answer the question like, what's our leverage with teachers unions? How do we actually change a teachers union that's been so fundamentally captured? Um, you know, and that to me is a tough nut to crack. I don't. Do you have ideas?
Well, we're brainstorming ideas at Defense of Freedom Institute, so stay tuned. We'll be
Okay.
sharing best practices for state level policy, because there are states that are tackling this. One
Yes.
would be Florida, and they've been doing this for a while, where a union can't automatically deduct dues from the teacher's
Uh huh.
paycheck. It's not an assumption because that's a source of their power, right? The
Right.
funding that automatically comes from that
Hmm.
teacher's paycheck. So cutting off the funding or easy access to the funding is a huge aspect of it. Ramping up awareness of alternatives to the union is really important. You don't have to join the union. They make it sound like you do because they're part of the orientation process. but cutting off their access to teachers, to young new teachers through that orientation, where they can tell them, if you don't join the union, these awful things will happen to you. That's important as well. And
Mhm.
then building awareness that there are alternatives that can provide the same benefits that unions do without the politicization, without the unhealthy harm that the unions do to K-12. So,
Yeah.
a couple ideas right there.
Yeah, and then in terms of teachers' colleges, there's this model of departments of civic thought that have been opened up in many universities that are sort of more immune from the far left wing education that you see in most humanities or social studies. Um, um, yeah, I'm blanking on that term. So you'll edit it out. Someone will edit it out. I'll just say that are coming from the humanities in many colleges. I'm wondering if we can create. There's sort of like alternative departments of humanities taught by professors who are not adherents to the ideology. Can you imagine creating new teachers colleges? Is that one possible approach where we just start to create more teachers colleges that are for classical education or free thinking and the like? What's your view on that?
Well, you mentioned classical education. I think that's a wonderful example of such something that's so positive that's happening in K-12 education right now. And all of those schools have teachers. So they are coming through universities well educated and ready to go. Um, we don't have to send every teacher through the teachers college pipeline. And if we break up the certification model that we have
Hmm.
in place, we don't have to have them go through education programs at all. So there's a number of different ways to tackle the power of the teachers college, but building new pathways is a really important one.
Thank you, Jenny. Really appreciate this conversation, and really feel like I learned a lot. And I'm looking forward to many of the great ideas you're going to bring out for groups like ours to help be better advocates. And looking forward to continued collaboration.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk through these things. We're running a million miles an hour at DC right now, but it's important to recognize that all of this is going to have an impact on K-12 education. So happy to be working with organizations like yours on having that positive impact.
Thank you very much.